Nearly every human being who ever lived had dark brown eyes. Not most people. Nearly all of them, for the entire 200,000-year span of anatomically modern human existence. Blue eyes, green eyes, gray eyes, hazel eyes, the whole spectrum of lighter colors people spend so much time being fascinated by and photographing and complimenting as if they were somehow more special, aren't a separate origin story running parallel to brown. They're a genetic accident that happened once in one specific place, thousands of years after brown eyes had already been the default setting for the human species for the overwhelming majority of its existence. So, if you're black and you have dark brown eyes, the honest scientific answer to where they come from isn't a mystery buried in some untraced bloodline, and it isn't hiding behind some undiscovered ancestral secret waiting for a DNA test to reveal it. It's the opposite. It's the single most direct, unbroken genetic inheritance a human being can carry, a trait connecting you in an unbroken line back to the very first modern humans who ever walked in East Africa. The real story here was never about explaining something unusual. It's about understanding why almost every other eye color on Earth is the actual exception. Start with the biology, because everything else builds on top of it. Eye color comes down to how much melanin sits inside the iris, the colored ring of tissue surrounding the pupil, and specifically how that melanin is distributed within a structure called the stroma, the front-facing layer of the iris. Melanin is the same pigment responsible for skin tone and hair color throughout the body, produced by specialized cells called melanocytes. When those cells pack a large amount of dense dark melanin into the iris, the eye reads as brown, ranging anywhere from a light honey or amber shade to a brown so deep it can look nearly black in certain lighting. When the melanocytes in the iris produce very little melanin, light passes through the mostly clear tissue and scatters, the same way sunlight scattering through the atmosphere makes the sky appear blue, producing what we perceive as blue eyes. Green and hazel sit in between, a product of moderate melanin levels interacting with that same light scattering effect. None of these colors involve a blue, green, or brown pigment actually existing in the eye. There's only one pigment in play, melanin, and eye color is essentially a readout of how much of it got deposited and how it's structured. Two genes do the overwhelming majority of the work in determining that outcome, and they sit right next to each other on chromosome 15, OCA2 and HERIXY2. OCA2 produces a protein, sometimes called the P protein, that helps build the cellular machinery melanocytes use to manufacture and store melanin. More active OCA2 output means more melanin production, which means darker eyes, skin, and hair. HERC2 sits nearby and functions less like a separate paint color and more like a dimmer switch, a regulatory region of DNA that controls how actively the neighboring OCA2 gene gets switched on in the first place. Research estimates that this OCA2 HERC2 region alone accounts for somewhere around 3/4 of all eye color variation in humans, making it by a wide margin the single most influential genetic location for this trait, though geneticists have identified more than a dozen additional genes, including TYRP1, ASIP, and SLC24A5, that each nudge melanin production up or down by smaller amounts, which is part of why eye color isn't a simple binary of only two possible outcomes, but a genuine spectrum running from the palest ice blue to the deepest black-brown. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, every single functioning copy of the OCA2 gene pushed in the same direction. High activity, high melanin, dark brown eyes, without exception. Researchers at the American Academy of Ophthalmology and multiple independent population geneticists have converged on the same basic timeline. Everyone on the planet had brown eyes until roughly 10,000 years ago. Not most people. Everyone. This wasn't a coincidence or a strange demographic fluke. It reflects straightforward evolutionary pressure. High melanin concentration in the iris offers real, measurable protection against ultraviolet radiation damage and glare, which mattered enormously for early modern humans living and working outdoors across the equatorial and subequatorial regions of Africa, where the species originated, and where sunlight intensity is at its highest anywhere on Earth. A gene variant that reduced that protection would have offered no survival advantage in that environment, so it simply never spread. The active, high melanin version of OCA2 wasn't one option among several. For tens of thousands of years, it was the only meaningfully viable one. That changed for a small subset of the human population only after groups of modern humans had already migrated out of Africa and settled much farther north, into regions of far lower and far more seasonal sunlight, specifically the area around the northwestern coast of the Black Sea. In 2008, a research team led by geneticist Hans Eyberg published findings in the journal Human Genetics, identifying a specific mutation near the OCA2 gene, sitting within the neighboring HERC2 regulatory region, that reduced OCA2's activity, essentially switching down the dimmer rather than eliminating the protein entirely. Eyberg's team traced every blue-eyed person of European descent alive today back to this single mutation, arising in one common ancestor somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. That's it. One person, one mutation, spreading forward through an unbroken chain of descendants across roughly 300 to 400 generations, eventually reaching the frequency it holds in parts of northern and eastern Europe today, where blue eyes are common specifically because that mutation had thousands of years to spread through populations living in an environment where reduced iris pigmentation carried no real survival cost, and where some researchers argue it may have even carried a mild selective advantage. Though the exact evolutionary pressure that allowed it to spread as fast as it did is still genuinely debated among population geneticists. That debate itself is worth walking through briefly, because it shows this isn't settled trivia. It's active research. One leading hypothesis ties the spread of light eye color, alongside light skin more broadly, to the reduced sunlight available at higher latitudes, where the body needs to synthesize vitamin D through the skin using whatever limited ultraviolet exposure is available, and where lower pigmentation levels across skin and eyes alike may have offered a modest efficiency advantage for that process. A separate competing hypothesis, sometimes called sexual selection, proposes that blue eyes may have spread partly because they became a rare, visually distinctive trait within specific populations, and rare traits tied to visible physical variation have, in some documented cases across evolutionary biology, spread faster than pure survival advantage alone would predict, simply because population members preferentially chose partners who displayed them. A third line of research has connected the same OCA2-HER-C2 region to seasonal light sensitivity and mood regulation, proposing a possible link between reduced iris pigmentation and lower susceptibility to seasonal affective patterns in populations living through long, dark winters. None of these hypotheses are mutually exclusive, and researchers studying ancient European genomes have found evidence consistent with unusually strong rapid selective pressure acting on this exact region of the genome, visible today as one of the longest uninterrupted stretches of reduced genetic diversity found anywhere in the modern European genome, a pattern that specifically indicates something pushed this particular mutation through the population unusually fast once it appeared. What's not in serious scientific dispute, regardless of which specific selective pressure ultimately proves most important, is the starting point in the timeline. The mutation is recent, it's traceable to one region, and it represents a deviation from, not the origin of, the ancestral human eye color baseline. Set that single event against the timeline of the OCA2 gene's high melanin form, and the actual scale of the comparison becomes clear. There's a forensic and clinical dimension to this genetics that's worth including too, because it shows just how confident scientists actually are in this mechanism, not as speculation, but as something precise enough to be used in real-world applications. Forensic genetics researchers have developed a prediction tool called IrisPlex, built specifically around variants in and around the OCA2-HER2 region, capable of predicting a person's eye color from a DNA sample alone with a documented accuracy exceeding 90% for correctly distinguishing blue from brown outcomes. That level of predictive precision doesn't happen by accident. It's the product of large-scale genome-wide association studies analyzing thousands of individuals across multiple continents, cross-referencing specific genetic markers against directly observed eye color over and over until the correlation became reliable enough to use in actual criminal forensics and ancestry testing services. When researchers say the OCA2-HER2 locus explains roughly 70 to 75% of eye color variation, that figure isn't a rough estimate pulled from a single study. It's been independently replicated across a wide range of population genetics research spanning more than 15 years, using different methodologies, different sample populations, and different sequencing technologies, all converging on essentially the same conclusion. Few traits in human genetics have this much independently corroborated evidence behind a single dominant genetic explanation, which is part of why eye color has become something of a model system for researchers studying how relatively simple, well-understood genetic architecture can still produce a visible, functionally important human trait. The active, dark eye version of OCA2 has been running continuously in the human lineage for the entire span of Homo sapiens' existence, roughly 300,000 years by current estimates from fossil and genetic dating, and arguably longer if you trace the same basic melanin regulation machinery back through earlier hominin ancestors. The mutated, low melanin version tied to blue eyes has existed for somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years, a sliver of time so small relative to the full history of the gene that on any proportional timeline it would barely register as a blip near the very end. Dark brown eyes were never waiting to be explained. They're the ancestral state the entire species carried for over 97% of its existence, and they still are the global norm today, worn by somewhere between 70 and 80% of the entire human population, with concentrations running even higher in specific regions, over 90% across South, East, and Central Asia, and by most population level estimates, between 75 and 85% across the African continent, spanning the full range of shade from lighter amber-brown tones through to the deepest near black-brown that reads as the richest expression of the trait. That range within brown itself deserves its own explanation, because dark brown eyes aren't one single uniform outcome any more than brown skin is. The specific depth of a brown eye, whether it lands closer to a warm honey or amber tone or reads as a deep, dense near black ash, comes down to exactly how much melanin gets packed into the iris stroma, and how densely those melanin granules are distributed, which is itself influenced by the combined activity of OCA2 alongside the smaller supporting genes like TYRP1 and SLC34A5. Higher, more consistent OCA2 and HERC2 activity, of the kind that remained essentially universal and unmutated throughout African population history, tends to produce the deepest, most saturated brown tones. Precisely because there was never any evolutionary pressure pushing that activity downward the way there eventually was in populations that migrated into low sunlight environments far to the north. In that sense, the specific depth and richness of very dark brown eyes commonly seen across black African and African diaspora populations isn't a separate genetic story from lighter brown eyes seen elsewhere. It's the same OCA2 HERC2 system running at consistently high, undiluted output, uninterrupted by the specific regional mutation that only ever affected a comparatively small, geographically isolated slice of the broader human population. It's worth being precise here about what this does and doesn't mean scientifically, because eye color research has a documented history of being oversimplified in exactly the way this video's title risks doing if it isn't handled carefully. For a long time, textbooks taught eye color as a simple Mendelian trait. One gene, brown dominant, blue recessive, full stop. That model is now understood to be substantially incomplete. Modern genome-wide association studies have identified as many as 16 or more genes contributing to eye color in humans, and researchers now describe eye color as a polygenic trait, meaning the final outcome is shaped by the combined additive effect of multiple genes working together rather than a single genetic switch. This matters because it explains real-world exceptions that the old single-gene model couldn't, cases where two blue-eyed parents have a brown or green-eyed child, something genuinely impossible under the simple dominant recessive framework, but fully explainable once you account for the additional genes beyond OCA2 and HERC2 that can independently boost total melanin output. Even so, OCA2 and its neighboring HERC2 region remain, by a wide margin, the single largest genetic contributor identified so far, responsible for an estimated 70 to 75% of eye color variation on their own, which is why the 10,000-year story anchored on that specific gene remains the central, scientifically accurate backbone of this whole trait's history, even as researchers continue refining the smaller details around the edges. This polygenic reality also explains something a lot of families notice firsthand without ever connecting it to the underlying science. Siblings, even full biological siblings with the same two parents, can sometimes end up with noticeably different depths or tones of brown eyes, or in rare cases, a genuinely different eye color entirely. Under the old single-gene model, that kind of variation within one family was hard to explain cleanly. Under the modern polygenic model, it makes complete sense. Each parent carries their own individual combination of variants across OCA2, HERC2, and the dozen or so supporting genes, and each child inherits a different random combination of those variants from both parents. The same basic shuffling process responsible for ordinary sibling variation in height, skin tone, or facial structure. Two siblings can each end up with brown eyes that are both, genetically speaking, well within the ancestral high melanin range, while still looking visibly different from each other in shade and depth because the specific combination of supporting genes each child happened to inherit wasn't identical, even though the core OCA2 output driving the baseline brown coloring was shared. None of that variation represents any kind of anomaly or exception to the ancestral pattern described here. It's ordinary genetic recombination operating entirely within the boundaries of the same unmutated, high melanin ancestral system, producing the full natural range of brown tones the trait has always been capable of expressing. There's a global genetic mapping dimension to this story too, one that adds real texture beyond the simple ancestral versus mutant framing. Large-scale population genetics, studies examining the OCA2 HERC2 region across thousands of individuals from Europe, East Asia, and Africa have found substantial differences in allele frequency at this locus between those populations. Differences large enough, in some cases ranging from 10 to 35 percentage points, to serve as reliable predictors of regional ancestry on their own. Researchers have also found that the specific genetic markers associated with brown eyes in European populations aren't identical to the markers associated with brown eyes in East Asian populations, which suggests that some of the fine-grained genetic tuning behind brown eye pigmentation evolved along at least partially separate regional paths after modern humans dispersed out of Africa, even though the foundational ancestral high melanin form of OCA2 itself traces back to the same African origin point shared by every human population on Earth. In other words, brown eyes aren't just old. They're also, in a very real sense, the genetic thread every single human population on the planet still shares a version of, no matter how differently that shared thread later got fine-tuned by regional evolutionary history after people spread out across 6 continents. This is also a useful moment to separate dark brown eyes cleanly from an entirely different topic that sometimes gets tangled up with it in casual conversation. Skin tone and its relationship to eye color aren't the same genetic story, even though both involve melanin. Skin pigmentation is controlled by a substantially overlapping but not identical set of genes, including SLC24A5 and SLC405A2, among others, genes whose activity can vary somewhat independently of the OCA2-HERC2 eye color system. This is precisely why skin tone and eye color don't always track together in a simple, predictable way, even within a single ethnic or regional population, and it's part of why treating dark brown eyes as some kind of secondary or derivative marker of a broader ancestry story misses what the genetics actually show. Dark brown eyes aren't downstream of anything else. They're their own direct, well-documented genetic outcome, tracing back through the OCA2 gene's ancestral, unmutated form specifically, not simply as a byproduct of skin color or any other trait riding alongside it. There's a cultural history layered on top of this genetic reality that's worth naming directly, because it explains why a scientifically backwards framing, treating brown eyes as the plain default and lighter eyes as the more desirable exception, took hold so widely in the first place, and it has very little to do with biology. Colonial-era beauty standards, exported globally through European political and economic dominance across the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, systematically positioned lighter skin, lighter hair, and lighter eyes as more desirable, more refined, or more attractive, a hierarchy enforced through everything from colonial-era caste systems to 20th century global advertising and film industries centered overwhelmingly in Europe and North America. That hierarchy had no basis in genetics or evolutionary history. It reflected the political and economic power of the populations it centered, not any underlying biological truth about which traits were older, rarer, or more evolutionarily significant. The genetics tell a completely different story than the one colonial-era beauty standards constructed, and it's worth sitting with the gap between those two things directly. The trait treated for centuries as unremarkable was, this entire time, the original, most evolutionarily stable, and most protective version of human eye color. While the trait elevated as more desirable was, this entire time, the geographically narrow, evolutionarily recent exception. Understanding the actual genetic timeline doesn't erase the cultural history built on top of it, but it does strip that cultural hierarchy of any claim to being rooted in biological fact, because it never was. Step back and look at what this actually means for the framing most people default to without thinking about it much. Culturally, blue and green eyes have often been treated, particularly in Western media, fashion, and beauty standards exported globally over the last century, as if they were the more notable, more remarkable, or even more genetically special version of human eye color, while brown eyes get treated as the plain, unremarkable baseline. The actual genetics run in the opposite direction entirely. Brown eyes are not the boring default sitting around waiting for something more interesting to happen. They're the original, highly conserved, evolutionarily stable trait that every human being's ancestors carried for the overwhelming majority of the species' existence, protected by real selective pressure tied to ultraviolet exposure, and still carried today by the clear global majority of human beings on every inhabited continent. Blue eyes are the outlier, the recent mutation, the genetic accident confined to a specific place in a specific narrow slice of time. If either color deserves to be treated as the unusual, noteworthy one, in a strictly scientific sense, purely by the numbers and by evolutionary age, it was never brown. For Black communities specifically, and for the African diaspora more broadly, this genetic reality carries a particular weight worth naming directly. Dark brown eyes, especially the deepest, most richly pigmented shades, represent the least interrupted, least diluted expression of the ancestral human OCA2 system still walking around today. Essentially unchanged in its core high output function since before recorded history, before agriculture, before written language, before any of the population movements that eventually produced every other eye color variant on Earth. That's not a small thing to be able to say about a physical trait. It means dark brown eyes aren't simply common, and they aren't simply the absence of something more interesting happening genetically. They're closer to a living genetic artifact, a direct functioning continuation of the exact biological setting the entire human species operated under for the first 290,000 years of its existence, still present, still fully intact, and still being passed down the same way it always has been, generation after generation, completely independent of any other ancestry story layered on top of it. None of this needs mythologizing to land as remarkable, and it's worth actively resisting the temptation to inflate it further than the actual science supports. The same way any honest, evidence-grounded treatment of this topic should, especially given how often this exact subject gets exaggerated online. Dark brown eyes aren't magical, and they don't require some hidden dramatic backstory to justify a video about them. The real story is simpler and, if anything, more genuinely impressive than a manufactured mystery would be. An unbroken evolutionary through line, verified independently by ophthalmological research, population genetics, forensic DNA analysis, and molecular biology, all converging on the exact same conclusion from completely different directions. Brown eyes came first. Brown eyes stayed dominant because they worked, biologically, exactly as they were supposed to. And for the roughly 3/4 of humanity who carry them today, especially across populations, like much of the African continent and its diaspora, where the original high melanin form of OCA2 was never interrupted by the specific mutation that eventually produced blue eyes farther north, dark brown eyes aren't a trait waiting for an explanation. They're the explanation itself, sitting directly in the mirror, connecting anyone who has them to the very first humans who ever opened their eyes to the African sun. That connection is worth closing on directly, because it's the part most documentaries covering eye color skip past, entirely in favor of chasing the rarer, flashier traits. Rarity gets attention. Age and continuity don't usually get the same spotlight, even when the science behind them is just as well established. Arguably more so, given how much independent research has converged on the same OCA2 timeline across forensic genetics, population studies, and evolutionary biology alike. But continuity is exactly what makes dark brown eyes genuinely significant, once you understand what's actually being inherited. It isn't just a color. It's a functioning piece of biological machinery, largely unchanged in its core operation for roughly 300,000 years, still doing today exactly what it evolved to do for the earliest members of the species, filtering ultraviolet light, protecting the eye's internal structures, and doing so with a level of pigment density that later, geographically limited mutations in other populations simply never replicated at the same intensity. Every person carrying that trait today is carrying forward the same biological configuration that existed before the pyramids, before the first cities, before the first written word, passed down through an unbroken chain of ancestors stretching back to the very origin of the species itself. That's not a small or ordinary thing to be able to say about something as simple as eye color, and it never needed an invented mystery to make it worth talking about. The science was always this good on its own.